This is an interview with Dr. Larry Diamond, a political scientist and leading scholar of democracy and democratic breakdown. In this conversation, he explains what makes elections truly free and fair, and how regimes get misclassified as democracy, and why modern democratic erosion so often happens gradually, due to slow destruction of checks and balances and the rule of law. You can read more about Dr. Diamond on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you, and enjoy the interview.
What was your childhood like, and what first sparked your interest in politics?
I had a fairly normal middle class upbringing in the city of Los Angeles. Uh, Maybe what was slightly unusual, but I think not very unusual, is that my mother in particular was very interested in politics. So I watched the Nixon-Kennedy presidential debate, which was the first televised presidential debate. I watched President Kennedy's inaugural address. I'd say those two things and just the inspirational character of John F. Kennedy's uh, presidency and the fact that we were watching the news every night and I don't know, I was just interested in politics. That's what sent me on this path.
What first pulled you into studying democracy specifically?
Well, I was kind of political as a student from elementary school through high school. I ran for office. I was student body president of my high school. I also was a member of the Council of Student Body Presidents at Stanford. So I was doing politics, and I was very involved as an undergraduate student at Stanford in the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. But separate and apart from that, again, how do you explain why you like chocolate ice cream or fried chicken? I mean, there's some things almost that are intrinsic and hard to explain. Maybe they're almost genetic. But I can say that freedom has always been extremely important to me. I think this is an almost deeply ingrained psychological as well as value orientation. So I read, as you have probably read, because it transcends generations, George Orwell's books, particularly 1984 and Animal Farm, Brave New World, things like this. They really crystallized in me a passion for freedom. Um, I'm Jewish. We had growing up friends and family who had lost many relatives in the Holocaust, had escaped the concentration camps, or survived them is probably a better term. Still had the numbers tattooed on their arms from the concentration camps. And look, I was born 6 years after the end of World War II. So the uh, logical conclusion of democratic failure and the mutation of authoritarianism into totalitarianism and the worst human rights violations in human history were not far from my birth and my upbringing.
When you say democracy, what are the non-negotiable minimum conditions today, and where do analysts most often misclassify regimes?
Well, I wouldn't, yeah, yeah, I guess I wouldn't use the word non-negotiable, but I would use the word essential. And so if it's what you're seeking to be a democracy, it certainly should be non-negotiable. Um, there have to be free and fair elections that determine who will rule. And those elections have to confer, as they really have never done in Pakistan or Iran or Morocco, the real power to rule. You can't have power really residing with some hidden force like the military or the Ayatollahs. Not that elections in Iran have ever been free and fair, but in Pakistan, I'd say there have been elections that, in which the choice of the people, Benazir Bhutto, Imran Khan, whatever their other, strengths or weaknesses, they did emerge as the prime minister, but then they never really had the power to rule. So that doesn't count as democracy. And then you have to ask what constitutes free and fair, and there has to be a reasonably level playing field, relative minimum of political violence. People have to be free to organize, to campaign, to surface political parties, to express their views, to both register to vote and to present new political parties and candidates, which requires access to the political arena. And then there are a whole host of conditions about what constitutes fair in the voting process. You have to have a ballot, you have to have a neutrally administered electoral process. You have to be able to observe and verify that. There has to be an independent means of adjudicating electoral disputes. You can't have the existing regime be the ultimate arbiter, or the existing government that's up for re-election be the ultimate arbiter of whether it won or not. Otherwise, you get into the absurdity of Nicolas Maduro saying, no, I won with 51% of the vote, when a highly credible, well-organized, independent parallel vote tabulation shows that the opposition won 2/3 of the vote. I will say as well that fairness and neutrality in the drawing of electoral districts, if this matters in the kind of electoral system we have in the US, India, UK, Canada, and so on, of first past the post, this is also important. One person, one vote, and then, political neutrality in the drawing of these district boundaries. I wouldn't say that the US is not an electoral democracy because of the backward movement in terms of gerrymandering in the United States, but I would say that this obscenity of highly partisan gerrymandering of electoral districts, which has gotten much worse in the last 2 years, has diminished the authenticity and quality of electoral democracy in the United States.
After the US operation that captured Nicolas Maduro, do you see this as more likely to open a credible democratic transition in Venezuela or to trigger a new form of authoritarian reconsolidation? And what do you think this precedent ultimately does to America's own democratic credibility and rule of law norms abroad?
So, those are two questions. Let me take them one by one. I think that the United States action so far militarily in Venezuela to capture and remove President Maduro, I'm going to answer the second question first, sets a very dangerous precedent internationally. Um, you can argue about whether it's a violation of US law. I don't think any court in the United States would invalidate it. I think that probably uh, legal evidence against Maduro for drug trafficking and so on is probably quite substantial. I expect that he will probably be convicted in judicial proceedings, and that he and his wife will spend a long time in jail in the United States. I don't mourn for that. I think the man is, we know, was a terrible, deeply corrupt, human rights abusing uh, autocrat who ruined his country even further than his predecessor Hugo Chavez did. Whether he's guilty of the crimes alleged, I'll let the judicial proceedings in the United States determine. But once any country captures this sitting president of another country by military force and extracts him, however corrupt, abusive, criminal his rule may have been, it sets a dangerous precedent. And it probably does represent a pretty serious violation of international law. We could say that there's no way that this could be compared to potential Russian action against President Zelensky in Ukraine or Chinese action against President Lai Ching-te in Taiwan or some other parallel of a powerful authoritarian state acting against a neighbor they're trying to bully and destroy or absorb in a similar fashion. We could say there's no parallel because these other presidents were democratically elected, whereas Maduro stole an election. These other presidents were not engaged in, you know, criminal activity and massive corruption the way Nicolas Maduro had been. But, China and Russia are not going to make these distinctions. And we also pay a very heavy price for the uh, reputationally and in terms of soft power in the United States, in the world system, and our ability to lead and maintain international democratic coalitions and have legitimacy for other actions we'd like to take to combat authoritarianism. We pay quite a heavy price by this kind of unilateralism and this degree of coercion. I would have preferred a ratcheting up of economic power, economic sanctions. I actually have no problem interdicting illegal oil shipments. I'd like to interdict their shipments, their corrupt regime supporting shipments by plane of gold as well. Venezuela is now a significant gold producer and turn up the heat on the regime in a variety of ways. But that being said, um, I will just say that, sometimes you have to weigh the reputational costs, the soft power costs, the damage to international law and the international system against the urgency of what might be needed and the potential benefits of it. Um, you know, if we could have captured and killed or arrested Adolf Hitler in 1938 in advance of World War II, I think looking back on it retrospectively, no one in historical retrospect would have worried about, the violation of international law that might have been asserted to have been committed, weighed against, the potential benefit. But in this case, I think the only thing that could, in the long arc of history and in also the broad geopolitical and moral calculus, justify such a sobering step would be the launching of a process, the triggering of a process that would lead to the restoration of democracy and a legitimately elected government in Venezuela. And if that were to be a goal and an outcome of the process, it doesn't legally erase the fact that the action was a violation of international law. But in the long run, just as it has in Panama, with the arrest and removal by military force of Manuel Noriega in the beginning of the 1990s by President George Herbert Walker Bush, no one is complaining now about the fact that the United States may have violated international law by invading Panama and ultimately seizing General Noriega. And I don't think you'll find many Panamanians today who complain about that, given the political stability they've had, the remarkable economic success they've had, the freedom from tyranny they've had, and the democracy they have had. But if the only goal is oil, and American imperial hegemony, then you compound one very dubious action with an even greater, frankly, crime. My deep frustration and mounting outrage over what Trump is doing is laying the action itself aside for history to judge in the future. The fact that President Donald Trump seems to have no interest in or commitment to achieving a transition to democracy and a restoration of legitimate and, responsible government in Venezuela. It's just about how can we get political stability and a pliable government so we can get the oil out. And I think that is tragic and disgraceful and deeply damaging to America's position in the world.
Iran is seeing major protests again, with the government restricting internet access and thousands pouring into the streets. If Iran's protests were to produce real political change, what does a plausible path to a more democratic order actually look like? And what would it change in Middle East regional politics?
Again, you're posing two questions, so I'm going to take them in the order you asked them, and I'll begin by saying the following: um, the Venezuelan situation, the transitional possibility, the instability, and the Iranian potential transitional situation are different in many respects. One is that there has not been a decapitation of the leadership in Iran, and I'm not even sure what that would look like, since the leader of the regime is a decrepit, dying Ayatollah in his mid 80s who's not running the country on a daily basis. Um, and There has not been, since 2009 with the Green Movement, an election in Iran where there was sufficient contestation and freedom to have posed any kind of real choice for the Iranian people. And although the presidential election in 2009 was still constrained, and the challenger to the person who was declared to have won the election, Ahmadinejad, that challenger being Mousavi, was, in some way part of the system. He was a reformer and people rallied around him. And when the election was, I think, pretty clearly stolen from him in 2009, it was the most important, probably, uprising in the country, save for perhaps the current one. So back then in 2009, you had a clear alternative, right? It was the person and the set of elites, alternative elites around him who had won the presidential election. Today in Venezuela, you have an alternative government in waiting, led by the formally declared, well, the formal victor um, of the 2024 presidential election, the formal real victor in terms of him having been the presidential candidate who contested, Edmundo Gonzalez, but then the person behind him who had been disqualified and was the actual operational and moral leader of the Venezuelan democratic movement, namely the 2025 Nobel Prize winner Maria Corina Machado. So, in contrast to Iran 2009 and Venezuela 2024, 2025 to the current moment, there is in Iran today no alternative government, no alternative leadership, no one you can turn to and say, power must be transferred to this person or this group of people. And unless there's an alternative, the question emerges, well, what the heck do? You say the regime is illegitimate and it should go, but how do you transfer power to someone? Now, the situations are similar in a different sense. And the similarity is that inevitably, in each case, even if the regimes agreed to to withdraw, there would have to be some transitional period of time where there's some, either neutral political administration or, some interim government until a government with democratic legitimacy could actually assume responsibility. And in each case, in both Venezuela and Iran, there would then be a long, protracted, difficult, painful, perilous process of reconstructing the security order, um, creating new leadership for the army and the security apparatus, um, vetting some of at least the senior figures in the state, the civil service, the intelligence apparatus, and so on. So enormous, daunting complexities that might have some parallel to the collapse of the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989, and the need for lustration and vetting and so on and so forth. Um, the question then is, who could lead or preside over some kind of interim administration while the state begins to be reorganized and new elections could be held in Iran? And this is where it becomes slightly interesting because the son of the deposed Shah, Reza Pahlavi, has presented himself as that option. And while it has appeared to me, I will admit, a somewhat distant observer for quite some time, that uh, Pahlavi is viewed with, suspicion uh, in Iran, even by many democratic forces. And, there's no real desire to exchange, one form of non-democratic rule with another. In other words, to restore, any form of absolute monarchy. I think the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, after all these decades in exile, is well aware of the fact at this point that that's not an option, and seems to be presenting himself as a purely transitional figure who could provide some kind of unifying and potentially legitimizing authority during a transitional period, after which there might be a restoration of the monarchy in a purely symbolic and constitutional form, the way there's a king of England or a king of Spain. That is a plausible scenario. Um, but how a transition from predatory, deeply repressive, uh, vengeful, authoritarian rule in Iran, whether it has the superficial patina of of religious legitimacy, blessed and in some way presided over by the Ayatollahs, or whether that falls away and it's just the, naked dictatorship of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the whole corrupt, kleptocratic security apparatus. Either way, it isn't clear, how this extraordinary uprising of the Iranian people and the mobilization of civil society with such massive numbers and such obvious courage could actually bring about a change. Um, my view is not an optimistic one in either case. I think the rulers in Venezuela and the rulers in Iran are dead enders who will not surrender power unless they're forced to. And so, literally, I don't think in either case they're leaving unless there's a gun at their heads. And in this case, pretty literally. And they realize that if they don't cut a deal that would enable them to keep some of their ill-gotten resources and to survive physically, they might lose everything. And that implies, in each case, unfortunately, uh, much greater mobilization of coercive threat, if not actual deployment of coercion, than I think is probably feasible.
Stephen Miller is widely described as a major strongman policy driver in Trump's second term. What does it tell you about modern democratic vulnerability when so much agenda setting concentrates in a small White House policy circle?
Well, you asked one question, but I'd like to answer two. The first question is the one you asked. What does it mean? It means that it's when you have American foreign policy or any kind of U.S. government policy initiative determined by such a narrow, closed, inward-looking circle of individuals led by a president who is as uh, detached from reality and from the political and constitutional constraints of American democracy as Donald Trump is, it's not only deeply problematic for the character of American democracy, it's almost always going to lead to really bad policy outcomes, right? Because you don't get the feedback mechanisms, you don't get the vetting of the different alternatives. You're kind of running uh, on impulse, and I think this was powerfully validated by Donald Trump's recent interview with the New York Times, where they asked him, "What constrains you?" And he basically said, "Only my own morality." I don't know that many people have detected much of that. Um, so everything we know that has been reported about the operation of this administration, particularly the second Trump administration suggests it's very narrow, uh, extremely weak in its consultation, not only throughout the different realms of the executive branch, but even more radically in terms of any consultation with the Congress or others who might provide contrary and sobering perspectives. And then there is the substance of what results from this kind of attitude, this kind of I'm in essence king and I can do whatever I want. I have immunity from any accountability legally or judicially because the Supreme Court gave it to me, and therefore that leaves only the blunt instrument of impeachment and removal from office. But we know that's impossible because even if the Democrats um, were to win control of the House of Representatives this November, which I think is likely, and even if they were to impeach President Trump again for even if they could make the case genuine high crimes and misdemeanors, there's no way that Senate Republicans are going to convict him. So it's kind of a waste of time and a performative exercise. And the more troubling thing still is the substance of this attitude, which was expressed in Stephen Miller's uh, interview in the CNN a while back, where very, very recently, actually, where he said, "We live in a world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power." So the argument is this is all that matters. Forget about international rules, forget about idealism. This had a familiar ring to me. So I actually kind of Googled around in the internet. And you know who uttered this phrase? The fundamental motif through all the centuries has been the principle that force and power are the determining factors. Only force rules. You know who said that?
That's Hitler. I saw it when I was researching for the interview.
Yes. Well, shows you how thoroughly you prepare. So this has a kind of fascist ring to it, and we thought this kind of mentality had been
Unplug the bell
discredited.
from the thing. Unplug it.
Say again?
Sorry. Oh, hello.
I think, yeah.
Oh, no, sorry. That was a accidental speaker.
Well, I assume you'll edit that out. But in
Yeah.
any case, we thought this kind of uh, bullying, aggressive, power mad mentality in world affairs had been laid to rest at the end of World War II and the construction of a new rules-based international order in which countries were constrained in what they would do and in which we had laid to rest, thousands of years of brutal human history based on the line from Thucydides that the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. But it now looks like this is the world we're going back to.
When Trump says, and I know you mentioned this, but when Trump says he's only restrained by his own morality and that he doesn't need international law, what does that tell you about the state of the USA, and what does this mean for democracy across the world?
I think this underscores what we knew from the first term and what's been clear from the early days of the second term of President Donald Trump, that he doesn't feel constrained by democratic norms, democratic principles, the Constitution, or the rule of law, um, and that we face a very serious challenge in defending our democratic constitutional order in the United States as long as he is the president.
And in the 21st century, how do democracies most often break down today? And which part of that process could be prevented if citizens and institutions understood them earlier?
Well, I talked about this at length in my 2019 book, Ill Winds. And the answer is, I think, now well recognized that for the most part, in the last 15 years or so, democracies have broken down through a gradual process in which an illiberal and ultimately authoritarian populist ruling party and executive comes to power, promising to cleanse the country of corruption and elite domination, and then proceeds to abuse power, become even more corrupt, and gradually destroy checks and balances, stack the judiciary, stack the civil service, use the state as a weapon against political opposition, intimidate and destroy the independence of the media, universities, think tanks, and so on, and gradually construct an authoritarian regime in which the state punishes opposition and rigs elections and makes it extremely difficult for the democratic opposition not only to exercise accountability in between elections through the legislative and judicial processes, but even to achieve accountability through elections because of the distortion of the process and the authoritarian control of it by the ruling party. That has happened in a variety of countries: Turkey, Venezuela, Hungary. I think more recently, India is well on its way there. Mexico probably as well. Other countries have crept toward it and, like Poland, pulled back somewhat. And this process is underway in the United States. Fortunately, our institutions are older, stronger, more resilient. Our civil society is deeper, but that doesn't mean we're immune from this process. And we face deep, sobering, and dangerous challenges from this type of project in the United States.